Okay, so good morning and welcome to our last day of the Norman Mandela Law School Legal Aid Clinic Fair. Guests online and students here, special welcome. I am Janet Levy, attorney at law at the clinic, and I'll be your moderator for the day. As we continue our discussion on the land, sea, and me, I want us to consider what is it that you want your future to look like? How do you think climate change will impact that? And what can you do to lessen the impact of climate change? This is our future that we are discussing, and primarily so yours as students of the law school. As you go out into this world, as you look at your future, think about that. I welcome Miss Annalie Loy to introduce our guest speaker for the day.
Good morning, everyone. It is my honor to introduce our guest speaker for today's presentation, Dr. Dalea Bean. Dr. Bean is the head of the Institute for Gender and Developmental Studies, Mona Campus Unit. A historian by training, she has worked towards gender justice for over 16 years, locally, regionally, and internationally. Her most recent publication, an edited collection with Professor Vereen Shepherd, Gender-Based Violence in the Caribbean, a historical roots, contemporary continuities, will be published by the UE Press in 2025. A warm welcome to Dr. Dalea Bean.
Thank you so much. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Good morning. So it's a little odd for me to be sitting to do a presentation, but I will obviously work with the setup that has been given to me here. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you this morning. I was saying to some persons when I came in that I've been at the University of the West Indies, wow, a good 20 odd years from undergraduate. And I was today years old when I came down here. So I didn't know how to find it. I know it exists, of course, but this is the first time I'm actually in this building, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. So we are going to be looking at the concept of gender and climate change. And I know that we are on YouTube, but it's very difficult for me to do a presentation and not have some form of interaction and feedback. And so I do ask that you get ready to answer one or two questions so I can get a sense of the temperature and the pulse in terms of some of these gender issues. This is not advancing. Oh, it's stuck a little. Okay, one second. Okay. All right. So what are we going to look at this morning? So we're looking at what is gender, which I think particularly in today's climate, we're looking at climate change, but we have lots of climate dealing with. And in today's climate, gender is a very contested and controversial term. And so definitely want to start by looking at, when we say gender, what is it that we are speaking about? Obviously, what is climate change? And then, of course, wrapping with the links between gender and climate change and the role of gender in climate justice, because at the end of the day, we're not interested in just focusing on the issues, but working towards solutions. So, what is gender? And this is one of the questions. Let me go back just a little bit. This is one of the questions that I have for those of you who are in the room. Not sure if there's any interaction that's possible through online. The chat, if we can get some persons in the chat too, that would be great. In your estimation, in your understanding, what is gender? In just a sentence or a few words, would anyone like to say, to volunteer? A little bit louder so I can hear. Yes.
It's the, I guess, system. Oh, I think I'm loud enough. I beg. But it's the system or binary, I guess, that we use to how do I put it? I used to know. I guess how we define ourselves, how we move through the world. So it has less to do with sex or to do with presentation and perception. So I guess it speaks more to masculinity and femininity rather than male or female.
Very good start. Wonderful. Anyone else would like to add to that? We're talking about perceptions. We're talking about how we present ourselves, masculinity, femininity. Anyone want to add anything to that? When you see someone walk through the door and what you think about them, what does gender have to do with that? Anyone else? Anyone I don't know if the chat is being monitored. Huh? Oh, you're monitoring. Thank you so much. One more person? You're gonna have to speak in this presentation. Yes, we won't advance, and we'd like to advance. One more person. What is gender to you in your estimation? No one? Male and female. Thank you so much. All right. So let us get into what the agreed on concept of gender. So some of what you said, I didn't catch your name. What's your name? Lauren. Okay. All right. So a lot of what you said has a lot to do with gender. It is how we organize. You started by saying organize. That's the first thing that you said, a system. It is a system. It is a system that tells us, according to various cultures, how we organize our daily lives, in a nutshell. So it is related to biology. We do have the concept of man, woman, right? And you also use the word binary. And normally we consider gender to be in a binary. And this binary tends to tell us, how do we interpret the biological differences between men and women? So for instance, while biology may say that a woman will bear a child, will carry a child and bear a child, it is gender, the system, that tells us that that woman has primary responsibility for that child. It's her role to have responsibility for that child because she biologically carried that child, okay? It also tells us, as I said, if someone walks in through the door, what do you think about them? It also tells us, what is this person allowed to wear? How is this person allowed to speak, to carry themselves? Are they allowed to wear makeup or not? Are they allowed to paint their nails or not? What jobs can they get as a result of this biology that we see in front of us? So that is what gender is. So globally, communities interpret biological differences between and among men and women to shape social expectations. So we have expectations of persons, and this is what gender is all about, all right? So it refers to the roles and responsibilities of persons that are created in our families, societies, and cultures. So we all know about the agents of socialization. We learn how to be gendered. In the family, we learn what is appropriate and inappropriate for our culture and our customs. If we go to church or, well, I shouldn't just limit it to church, but a religious institution in our society will also tell us what is appropriate for you how do you behave, how do you act? And of course, our cultural norms are also connected to what gender is. And so the most important thing to know about gender, regardless of our views on other aspects of gender that may be trending really right now, is that gender is social. Gender is not biological. While it is related to biology, because societies use biology to create gender, gender is social. It is learned. We learn how to be male and female. And so it is not the same as biology, even though it is based on biology. So Caribbean feminist was a little dark on this, her picture, but Caribbean feminist Eugene Barito explains that gender is a complex system of personal and social relationships through which women and men are socially created and maintained, and through which they gain access to or are allocated status, power, and material resources within society. So again, if you notice, the word social is there because it is a social construct. The fact that it is a social construct does not mean it's not real, right? We have cultural DNA, we have biological DNA, we have cultural DNA. So it doesn't mean that there is any less realness about gender because it is social. But the point is that what we know about gender is learned behavior. And therefore, some things that we learn about gender can be unlearned, okay? Now, importantly, we're going to deal with climate change, but of course, you are law students. And so importantly is the issue of how we allocate things to people based on gender. So a lot of our laws, and I'm sure in your training you would have done these types of things, a lot of our laws are gendered. A lot of our laws will say, what can women do? Can women work after 10? Can women work in this type of industry? How do we protect women or men or children using legal frameworks? All of these things mean that it is gender that is telling us how do we organize our society and how does the law impact persons based on gender? There's nothing that is gender neutral. There's nothing that we deal with where gender is not important, but it is so deeply ingrained in us that sometimes it's like the air, we miss it. There's an atmosphere. It's invisible, but it's important to us. That is gender. Gender is constantly there and important to how we navigate the world and how we understand the world. But a lot of times we don't take note of it because it is so deeply ingrained in our society. Typically, when we think of gender, we think of women, or based on topics that are trending now, we may think of LGBTQ and various agendas that are being perpetrated as a result of a community of people. But I do want to reinforce to you that really all gender is speaking about is a system of how we organize our daily lives. If there are any questions, we'll take at the end, I assume. Yes. So if we look at these images, looking at different types of persons, different representations, what we're seeing here is that gender is cultural. That's the point of this slide. What is acceptable in one society, in one era, in one age group is not acceptable in another. So for instance, if you're a little boy in Jamaica at 3 years old and you put your feet into your mother's high heel shoes, it might be fine. Maybe in certain families, it might not. But generally, a little toddler trying to find his way around in his mother's shoes is funny and cute. That same boy at 16 doing that is a whole different story. So the gender expectation changes as you grow. Similarly with these images, we have an image, for instance, of a man from Scotland in a kilt, what we would call a skirt. We know it's a kilt. It's for royalty. It's for men. Women can't wear this. The fabric may be used by women if they're in a certain class of society, but women do not wear this garment. Yet in our society, a man wearing this has problem in half a tree. So gender is cultural. Also, the two images to the bottom there are speaking to what we consider to be ideals of beauty. In one society, the longer your lip, the broader, the more beautiful you are, the more likely you are to get a husband, the more likely you are to survive in that society. So we're not just doing these things because we want to be beautiful, but what does that mean for the allocation of resources as a result of what you're doing culturally? In another society, the longer your neck, the higher status you may have. So all of these are showing that culture is critical to our understanding of gender, right? Religion, too, looking at the woman in the burqa hijab, whichever one, sorry, I'm not sure which one. But obviously, too, religion deeply influences our understandings of gender, right? So it's cultural. Now, when we think of moving from segueing from just gender to looking at climate change, I did want to introduce some important concepts or reintroduce because these are things you may know. And this is just one possible explanation. You may have other views of what reality is. But when we think of gender, one of the things we think about is what does gender have to do with how we live our daily lives? Does everyone have the same access to resources? Does everyone live the same type of life? Obviously not. So in this conceptualization, reality is where one person, you can't even see the person. the way they have been given so much. They have been given so many advantages. Now, let me back up. The point of this image is to show access to the game, right? So there's a game, it seems like a baseball game is happening. We're talking about who gets to see the game. This person in the far left has been given so many opportunities that you can't even see them anymore. These are what we would consider to be the rich and wealthy in society. And based on gender too, this intersects because there are just certain genders that are just going to get certain advantages in life, right? It speaks to advantages. Then you have someone beside them who has got enough to see the game, has access, and you have a person who is shorter, obviously a toddler, or someone who has less advantage, who not only didn't get anything to access the game, but a hole has been dug for them. So there are some structural inequities that are keeping this person from accessing this game. Equality, and this is something we tend to speak about when we think of gender, equality is where everyone has received the same resource, but does everyone need the same resource? No. If you look at this based on the height of the first person, they don't need anything at all. If they got nothing, they would still have been able to see the game. The second person needed it, perfect. The third person got the same thing, and the system would say, but hey, we gave you $500. Why haven't you done anything with it? They're coming from further. So they're still not able to see it. Equity, which tends to be a more acceptable aim for gender, it has to do with your parity. You get what you need to have access. This is what we would call affirmative action and temporary special measures and quotas. When you think of gender quotas in parliaments and so on, we recognize that there are some advantages and disadvantages, that the society has some systemic and endemic advantages and disadvantages. And so if you need a little extra push, we're going to give you that little extra push, right? And justice, the difference with justice in this image is that the barrier is removed. Now, the question I have really is, on paper, this looks fine, or on screen, this looks ideal. Everyone either gets what they need to survive or to have access, or the barrier is removed altogether. My question for you is, what about this image would offend someone? What about this image of either equity or justice? So we're moving along a continuum. In equity, the barrier is still there, but you get what you need to see over this barrier. But we're moving and we got from, reality to equality to equity to justice. When we look at equity and justice, why would anyone be in disagreement with this? What would make someone be in disagreement? One and here and then two.
That this is demonstrating favoritism in one group as opposed to the other.
Favoritism, yes. Excellent response.
I was thinking that, is this on? I was thinking that perhaps a capitalist would look at that and go, but then nobody, who's paying for the game? If there's no barrier to entry, then how do we earn? And it brings me back to this sort of Inca society or those Aboriginal societies where everything belonged to everyone. So when we study history, we spoke about the Tainos. If there's a bench, the bench is everyone's bench. But in a society like that, there's nobody that's above anyone. And so someone with a capitalist mindset is going to struggle with that, because then how do I elevate myself above everyone if there's no barrier there? And how do I earn from that?
Excellent point. So we have the issue of favoritism, we have the issue of earning or hierarchies, power in society, hierarchies in society. Excellent. Anything else that stands out to anyone? Any final response? Why would someone be opposed to equity or justice?
I mean, within the confines of
Yes,
the image?
yes.
I mean, within the confines of the image, I can't think of anything else, but there's just okay, if we're going from the whole moving from reality to equity, there is just it's just plain and simple. People always say that more rules for one group doesn't mean less for or more rights for one group doesn't mean less rights for you, but that's just not true. If you're you were previously historically more enfranchised or have in a group that have more access, more rights, etc. If other groups are going to get rights that put them on the same level or status or standard as you, your quality of life is going to drop from what it used to be.
Or you think it will.
I don't agree with that.
No, but no. So
Okay.
but even if it doesn't, the perception is reality. So it may drop because maybe resources have to be spread elsewhere and you have less access to university spaces, you have less access to jobs, whatever the case may be. But even if that does not happen, just the perception that you're not high up in the sky and you're on the same level, there are no barriers, that is one of the main challenges. And this, of course, links to this issue, along with what you have said in relation to hierarchies and money and access. All of these things are how we intersect the concept of gender and climate change. Now, of course, I think most of us do have some sense, but we can have our textbook definitions here of climate change. So climate change, of course, we're thinking about this long-term change in average weather patterns that have come to define the Earth's local, region, and global climates. These changes have a broad range of observed effects. And of course, the critical thing regarding climate change where we're concerned is that we're talking about human behavior. So we're not speaking about just natural evolutions and things that would have happened if no humans were here, but we're speaking about the use of fossil fuels, burning of fossil fuels. This increases the heat trapping greenhouse gas levels in the Earth's atmosphere, raising the Earth's average surface temperature. And what are some of these impacts? Temperature increases, rising sea levels, ice loss, mountain glaciers melting, problems, hurricanes, heat waves, wildfires, droughts. All of these things are what we're speaking about when we're speaking about climate change. Now, as I said before, I found this image which I thought was very fitting. I don't think it was just done, but one of the issues to do with climate, and it links to this issue of equity and all of these things, is capitalism. So it's very interesting that you said a capitalist would look at those images and say, who's paying for the game? How do I earn? In fact, there was once when I did a workshop and I used the same image, someone from another country said, you can't have justice if the people aren't civilized. So if you have no barrier, people will just march into the game, destroy the resources and so on. And so culturally, we have different understandings of what being civilized means. But capitalism is very critical. It's another layer of the intersection among climate, gender, and then, of course, capitalism. Because what capitalism says and what feminist researchers say about capitalism is that capitalism is in sync with patriarchy, right? What is patriarchy? Simply put, it's the rule of the father. It is that system that speaks about male dominance, male superiority, male leadership. All of these things have to do with patriarchy. And as a result of patriarchy, we have systems such as capitalism and extractionism, which are not gender neutral. Now, in the world of feminist theorizing, a lot of the work will focus on the impact of women. And so I'll start here. There is a disproportional impact of climate change on women when we look at the statistics globally, all right? But before we even get there, we're going to look at this issue of patriarchy versus climate. And there are two quotes that I wanted to use as a jumping off point for that, both to do with extractivism. So when we think of extractivism, this is a non-reciprocal dominance-based relationship. Sorry, this is blocking my view here. 1 second. A dominance-based relationship with the earth. Sorry, lots of things blocking my access. Right. Extractionism is a non-reciprocal dominance-based relationship with the earth, one purely of taking. It is the opposite of stewardship, which involves taking but also taking care that regeneration and future life continue. And this is from the book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus Climate. The second quote says, extractivism is designed for the benefit of men and operationalized through the domination of women, nature, indigenous, and rural people. Women's exclusion from decision-making roles around extractives extends from work sites to corporate boardrooms to agenda-setting spaces on climate, environment, rights, and security. Even within families, communities, and social movements, women must navigate patriarchal norms that prioritize male leadership and regulate women to support regulate women to supportive or caretaking roles. Both of these concepts are looking at how do we use the earth for our benefit? And there are many ways to use the earth for our benefit. Extractivism is only one way. Now, if you look at the first quote, it resonates to me to colonialism. It's speaking about the modern concept of extraction. But when I think about it, I think, as we heard, that history is critical. It speaks to this issue of just taking and taking and taking and not reciprocating, not caring for what you're taking, right? Then the second quote is speaking specifically to a view that extractivism is male-driven. Now, the interesting thing as a researcher that I find very funny about patriarchy is that even though patriarchy is male rule or male dominance, one, it is not only held up by men, because in some cases, women are extremely good holders of patriarchy and do a lot better job at keeping patriarchy in place than men do. And also, patriarchy does not only affect women. Yes, there are many ways in which patriarchy affects women, but patriarchy also negatively affects men. It's why we have so much crime and violence. We know the statistics. Men tend to be the ones killing men. As much as women suffer from the hands of men suffer from the hands of men in much greater numbers. So we're going to get to the balance, but this specific quote is speaking about how does extraction relate to women? And the reason that persons and organizations have done work on this is that for many, many years, the concept of climate and extraction was seen as just neutral. It just impacts it's just a thing that happens and it just impacts everybody the same way. But it does not. Some men are at the seat of power. Some women are the ones that have to deal with caregiving, fetching water, sanitation, small farming, all of these things. And the way we enter society based on gender, it will allow us to be differentially impacted by climate change. So this is what this is saying. So it doesn't mean that you have to agree that climate change is particularly targeting women, but we have to look at the fact that there's nothing that will be gender neutral because we all do not have the same platform in society. And that was really the point too of showing you these images of how we're all regulated differently in society. If we are already at the lowest bottom, a hole is dug for us in society, climate change is going to impact us more. That is really the point, all right? So there's also the issue of the violence of extraction. So one of the concepts of climate change and gender, which we'll look at a few stats in a bit, is that climate change is deeply connected to gender-based violence. But before we even get to what happens as a result of climate change, there is the violence of extraction. And this quote assists us with that. So when industry enters a community for the purpose of extracting resources, the disruptions to land and community life often lead to violence. Violence may be perpetrated by individuals, as in the case of murder or rape, but it is also structural, meaning it is embedded in social, economic, political systems that enact harm to the marginalized and serve the interests of the powerful. Violence in the extractive context is also gendered in terms of how it operates as well as who it benefits and who it harms. Now, the important line here is the issue of the marginalized. Typically, in most spaces, the marginalized tend to be women. Globally, women are the poorest in most societies. They often have less status in society. And so this is why this type of languaging will speak about the violence of extraction as being particularly harmful to women and girls the world over. So all of this is to say that the climate crisis is not gender neutral. For most who are studying this, Women and girls experience the greatest impacts of climate change, which amplifies existing gender inequalities and poses unique threats to their health, livelihood, health, and safety. As I said before, women make up the majority of people living in poverty. They often bear the most responsibility when it comes to caring for families and communities, yet they have limited financial and land powers, and 1 in 3 women already faces gender-based violence globally. So if we just look at this slide here in blue, or the image here in blue, it is very easy for us sometimes to use our own scenarios to think about women advancing in society. So for instance, even in Jamaica, we have statistics that say we're among the highest in terms of middle managers. Women are obviously in the education, tertiary education, we are progressing. But when we look at women in our country, in our societies, and globally, overall, women are the poorest. Regardless of the status of women as earners and business persons and leaders, women have the most responsibility for caring for children. As soon as there is the threat of a disaster, it's normally and usually women who have to figure out, okay, we're going to get bread, we're going to get this, we're going to get that, we're going to fix up the space, we're going to have water. It tends to be the women who are doing that. And this is for what we'd call middle class women, right? Rural women, the issues are similar, but adding issues of poverty, adding issues of communication. So even when we look at a little further down and we speak about persons living with disabilities, all of these come together, all your existing social statuses and identities in society come together and create that perfect storm when we think of climate change. If you're already marginalized in society, when you have disastrous climate impact or changes over time, you are going to be the ones who feel it the most. Yet, the ones who feel it the most are the ones who have the least power to change it. And this is also why, generally, when we look at SIDS, we are the ones that tend to suffer most from climate change, but are the ones who are least able to do anything about this in terms of structural and systems, right? Global systems. If 1 in 3 women and girls globally face issues of gender-based violence, what do we think is going to happen when there's a climate issue? How is that going to exacerbate what already takes place in those societies, right? And when we get to the issue of masculinities, we'll speak about why some of these things are. So some of the statistics here show us that basically the first one is saying that women are the ones who are experiencing the issues or have to deal more with the blowback from drought. Why is this? Because women are the ones who get water. Women tend to be the ones who have the greatest responsibility for finding water for the family. When you have drought and women have to walk further to get water from their communities and wells dry up and other issues of climate change, you are now more vulnerable in terms of gender-based violence, in terms of being trafficked, in terms of being attacked on the street, right? So it's a cascading issue. The same issue here with floods. The third one says that by 2050, close to 60 million women and girls globally may be pushed further into poverty as a direct result of climate change because of food insecurity. And I think it was just 2 days ago that the Gleaner had an article on this and the ways in which we have been suffering from food insecurity as a result of the many storms and issues that we've had. Beryl, we still haven't recovered from Beryl. You go into the supermarket now or the market, vegetable can't buy. Can't find no eggs. Yeah, people suffered in Christmas with their Christmas cake. There are very pressing issues of food security. And if women are tasked with the primary responsibility of providing food for our family, this is the reason why we're speaking about these issues as on-the-ground issues for women. Globally too, women own less land and have less secure rights over land than men. So they are owning less land, but they're the ones that are the majority in the labor force, in the agricultural labor force. All of this is saying again and reinforcing the justification for persons and researchers saying that we cannot overlook gender when we are thinking about climate change. We cannot only look at the science of climate change. We cannot only look at gender neutral policies, when we have policies for climate change, what are we doing in terms of women's access to changing these things? What are we speaking about when we look at women's access to increased cooperatives around land ownership? All of these things are critical when we think of climate justice. Importantly is this link between climate change and gender-based violence. Again, we have the statistics, 1 in 3 women have faced some form of violence. The statistics aren't different for our own country. I believe the last one said about 1 in 4 women have faced some form of gender-based violence or will experience some form of gender-based violence in their lifetime. Gender-based violence, numerous causes. One of the major things is the issue of inequality and the perception of women. And so if women inherently face gender discrimination and remain largely excluded from decision-making processes, then this is exacerbated when we have climate impact. The growing worldwide evidence shows that GBV against women increases during and after disasters, and I believe the next slide has some statistics for this. In the period of disasters, including climate change-related migrations or displacement, it has been shown that women and girls face more sexual and domestic violence. And then we have other intersections. So women aren't, when we're speaking about women in particular here, women aren't a homogeneous group. Men aren't a homogeneous group. We have women who are gay. We have men who are living with a disability. We have different identities. We have age. We have all of these things that are coming together to make persons who they are, right? So persons living with disabilities are doubly marginalized and impacted by climate crises. Those with disabilities are more likely to be harmed, mostly through limited access to information, limited mobility, and decision-making and resources. So even in our own society, we see the shift, the slow shift towards, for instance, having deaf interpreters on our television, right? But traditionally, when we have bulletins going out about impending disaster, persons with disabilities are left at a disadvantage if they don't have someone with them in terms of interpreting or interacting with the services that should even be helping them with climate mitigation. When you go to a shelter, do you have someone there who is signing? Do all shelters have wheelchair access? Right? Or policies in Braille? So these are some of the challenges when we think of not only gender, but how gender intersects with other of our identities as well.
Good morning. A question. It's a compact question. The statistics you just shared, and you have been sharing with the disparity between how climate change affects male versus female. Is it across the board for developed nations versus those that are developing and small island states versus underdeveloped nations? And I ask because it's widely known that educational attainment usually translates into earnings. And the level at which you earn throughout your lifetime, whether you're college educated versus just a high school diploma. And it's also widely known that women, especially in developed nations and many developing nations as well, are when you check out the enrollment in colleges and so forth, there's a huge disparity between the male and the female gender. I mean, take this classroom just right now. When you look at the level, the ratio between the female and the male, it's just big. And so I asked, is it that the disparity with the effect of climate change on the two genders, is it more pronounced in some nations? I.e. maybe the underdeveloped ones, or is it across the board when you compare how pronounced is it in the US or the UK and Caribbean islands? Is it that significant to say that all the actions, and I'm going to speak to the equity, and you spoke to affirmative action early. And I have a question on that later. But is it warranted that we must put these things in place so much, especially in the developed and those developing nations?
Right, really good question. And you said it's compact, but it really comes down to that. Is the disparity the same? And so no, it is not, right? So in developed nations, and that's why I was using at a point too to say that our situation in small island developing states is really critical. But yes, the information and the statistics will be different for developing nations in particular, not just for women, but just the quality of life. That's why I use the example to say, the more marginalized you are in a society, the more you're going to be impacted by anything, including climate change. So if generally your society operates at a different level, most persons are educated, there's access to information, you are generally better prepared for climate disaster, all of those things are going to vary the impact. But what the reports, and this will give a nice answer to your question too, what the reports show is that regardless of where you live, your gender cannot be ignored from the conversation. So even in a developed nation like the United States, the impact in a specific state with a specific climate issue is gendered. So one of the first ones here is Hurricane Katrina on this slide. Rape rose 53 times rape of women increased 53 times during and after that disaster. So yes, overall, you'll have disparities in how best we're able to mitigate and manage climate based on developed versus developing. But individual climate issues are gendered, and we have to take that into consideration. So that's the overall point. It's not to say that everyone is going to have the same impact, right? But the statistic of 1 in 3 women, it is global. Regardless of whether we're in developed or developing nations, gender-based violence across the board, 1 in 3, 1 in 4 women have experienced or will experience that. That is a universal principle, unfortunately. All right. And so, but thank you so much for the question. I look forward to the other one that you said you had. So this gives us some snapshots of different spaces. So your question was quite serendipitous because this is now giving us what does it look like in different spaces, right? So we already looked at the one for following Hurricane Katrina. Between 2016 and 2019, there are over 1,600 acts of violence recorded in Mexico and Central America against women, environmental and human rights defenders. So we haven't got to the issue yet of the work against climate injustice, sorry. But obviously we have persons who are doing the work and we are well aware of that. Those persons tend to be women. Those women tend to be attacked as a result of what they're doing because it's cutting down on bottom line. It is shaking up the status quo. It may be stopping the concept of extractionism. So these persons are a threat, right? And so you have these recorded acts of violence specifically against the defenders who tended to be women. In Ethiopia, there was an increase in girls sold into early marriage in exchange for livestock to help families cope with the impact of prolonged droughts. So here we have the issue of cultural understandings of marriage. Again, gender is culture. The culture that you have in your space will determine the type of impact that happens to you based on climate, based on food security, insecurity, based on extractionism, and so on. Nepal witnessed an increase in human trafficking from an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 annually. Okay, there's a missing year here. Anyway, in 1990 to 12,000 to 20,000 per year after an earthquake. Issue of human trafficking here. And then the final one in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria in 2017, there was a 62% increase in requests for survivor-related services. And this has to do with gendered violence in the home. We all know too what happened, for instance, during COVID. That's not a climate change issue. But whenever there is stress and strain in the society, we see the increases of gendered, especially physical and emotional gender-based violence. All right. And so this gives you a good, not a good, but a bad picture of what happens specifically to women as a result of either climate change or the fight against climate change or the ripple effects in terms of food insecurity, movement, displacement, and so on. Now, of course, the issue of men and boys. And I think one of the, beautiful things about doing gender work is that in most disciplines, gender work starts with women, but it cannot end with women. And so if you look chronologically at the reports and research that is done on climate change and gender, perhaps 10 years ago, we're only seeing reports that are looking at the impacts of women and the statistics on women. But out of that flows this realization, this light bulb moment. Oh dear, look, men have a gender too. It's like brand new information. Men don't tend to see themselves as gendered, and we don't tend to see men as gendered, but men are gendered. What does that mean? It means that, and how does this link to climate change? So even though women may have, generally speaking, women may have larger responsibilities for finding water or finding food and making sure the pantry is stocked, the role of men in climate is absolutely critical. Not just because they tend to be the ones who may be heading corporations that are causing it, or heading corporations that are funding issues of climate change, but what about men on the ground? What about the man who is tasked with securing the house or your dwelling during a climate crisis? What about the men who have in their mind that they should be breadwinners in society, but as a result of climate crisis, do not have jobs? And so this is why we see an increase in, we can't just talk about an increase in gendered violence without looking at what is behind that. A lot of it is the psychological strain that climate change puts on men. A lot of this you're not speaking about. So is there counseling that's specific to post-climate issues for men specifically? Are men able to get together and talk about the impact that this volcano had in St. Vincent? Or are we just thinking that, whoa, let's try to get the women some support services for gender-based violence? Absolutely not saying that's not important, but the support has to be to look at who are the perpetrators of this violence and why they perpetrate this violence. And so you will notice that a lot more of the more modern, in the last 5-6 years and so on, a lot more of the modern research is looking at the ways in which men are impacted by climate change as a result of the gender expectations that persons have of them, and the ways in which climate change itself is gendered. What do I mean by that? I mean that, for instance, we have research that shows that, which is the second bullet, that links have been made to eco-friendliness and the perception of femininity. So once you start going green, there's this perception, this is soft, this is to care for the environment. For some of us, it may be positive, but for some, it's not. It's removing that hard, masculine responsibility that we have to extract from the earth. So even the concept of what is causing climate change is linked to gender, even though climate change is not a person. The concept of climate change is gendered because we see extractionism and industry and capitalism and earning, we see that as masculine. And that's why we have even the issue with the image of Trump. That's why Trump and other leaders will have an appeal, because he's signifying a strength and a masculinity that America needed or needs, all right, or the perception that that is needed. Once you start to go green, once you're not burning coal, once you're doing eco-friendly things, this is now moving into a softer kind of life, which is traditionally seen as feminine. And that is not ideal for everyone. So even when they have done, research was done on men for the country, but men's ability to use a simple thing like eco-friendly bags, they found that they didn't want to use it because the perception in that community was that the bags are for women. Is women must use these types of bags. It's not for men to use these types of bags. So all of these are to say that we cannot look at the issue of climate change and not look at the issue of masculinity, not only as a perpetrator, but as a beneficiary and as persons who are harmed by it. So what's the first bullet? I skipped to the second one, but the first one says that a report by the World Health Organization shows that in times of drought, male farmers in developed and developing countries experience higher rates of suicide due to weaker or non-existent support networks. So again, we're not talking to the men. We just expect that they must just button up the house. Where they're getting it from? Are they even able to button up a house? All of these are questions we're not asking men. It's just their responsibility to do so. So that's important. Also, not necessarily here, but a lot of the suicide rates too relate to what men have to be relegated to do in post-climate disaster situations. So do you have to take jobs that you believe are beneath you? Do you have to take indignities? When you're displaced and in another country, another language, and the masculinity is just different there, and you have to do things that you didn't think you would have to do as a man. All of those issues to feed into this higher rate of suicide. Also, the rate of suicide for men globally is higher than women. All right. So the point here is that men and boys are impacted by climate change in a gendered way, which is different to the impact of women and girls. But as I said, the entry point for most work on gender typically tends to be to look at women, which is absolutely important, but it gives us this wider lens to look at what's happening to our people as people. And so, of course, closing here with saying that men and boys are not a homogeneous group. Again, you have different types of men. A gay man or a trans man in a developing country dealing with climate is a whole different thing than a wealthy white male dealing with it in that same country. All right. So the differential impact is not only based on masculinity, but other identities that we may take on. All right. Now, when we're wrapping up, again, I said that we're looking at this issue of gender and climate change. We're also going to be looking at the agents of change. And here too, women and men have played important roles and so on. Now, this image I always like to use because it shows us the ways in which women are not always at the seat of power, but they're the ones that are doing the work. So here we have a group of men sitting and they say, women, they're too busy to discuss water. They're the ones using the water, right? And a lot of times, while it might be obvious from this image, this is typically a lot of how we organize our societies. And this may be looking at men and women, but we're not only looking at men versus women. The point is the people who are feeling impact the most have to be the ones at the seat of the table to fix the challenges, all right? So we know that or believe that women in all their diversity must have equal leadership roles at decision-making tables where climate challenges and solutions are being discussed. Particularly important, and this is a group of people that we tend to not think about, particularly in our society, although we do have descendants of Indigenous persons here, is that Indigenous and rural communities, especially women and girls, they tend to already have unique roles with respect to land and natural resources, including as cultivators, producers, healers, and knowledge keepers, and environmental stewards. And I think what is happening in our modern world is that we're losing a lot of that knowledge. Anyone who has grown with a grandparent or great-grandparent will be able to tell you when rain is going to fall. They just know there are things that come from that rural space of knowing whether it's your knee sees up or the sun, the way the sun look. I mean, my mother is not even all that old and she look and tell me, okay, it's going to rain tomorrow because there's a ring around the moon. And she's a well-educated, whatever. It's not about that. It's about that indigenous knowledge that she had from rural Jamaica, that you know how to navigate because you're farming and you know how to read the signs. A lot of that has, of course, we've improved on our technology, and technology is important. But when you have communities that are extensively based on indigenous knowledge forms, what are we doing to harness that? Right? What are we doing to elevate that rather than putting it down as sorcery or old-fashioned or all of these things? So in our own communities of Maroons and Indigenous people, are we doing enough to tap into their understandings of the environment? Then, of course, we have some regional organizations. I just wanted to highlight some actual persons doing the work. Some you may know already. So, for instance, Helen's Daughters, I think this is based in St. Lucia, but does work all over the Caribbean, particularly with women farm hers, for farm hers, by farm hers. And this is one of many of these organizations that's using the power of women as indigenous knowers, as farmers, as various things to mitigate issues of climate, to work on food security and insecurities. And so this is a wonderful resource. They have wonderful resources on this website and lots of important connections being made across the region to mitigate the issue of climate. I also wanted to highlight just one, but an important wave in Jamaica in terms of women in climate change. One of which is Aisha Constable, and she founded Girls Care, which is climate action for resilience and empowerment. yeah, I can share the PowerPoint. I'm not going to read all this, but really what this is speaking about is her focus on girls as being aware of your impact on climate. We all have an impact, and sometimes we believe that because we're not the ones with the industrial complexes that we don't have this. But even women use far more products than men on a day-to-day basis. We're doing the perfume and the lotion and the hair, and all of these things are increasing that impact, all right? A lot more waste too. So she has particularly looked at focusing on women and girls as not only contributing, but mitigating. Very, very good work being done by her, and very important that she's focusing on the youth so that we can get and build those resilient strategies from young going up. And of course, the importance of strong male allyship, and this links to what I was saying before in terms of men, a lot of men seeing eco and green as feminine, the importance of having the male organizations. This Eco-Men Summit, I think this was held in Indonesia in 2024. But the point is they move around, and it's very, very important that we have strong male allyship, not just of owners of industry, but men who are very comfortable with being eco-friendly and masculine. As simple as it is, it's not always the thing that resonates. All right. So I think that's where I'll stop. And thank you for your attention and participation. Any questions?
Right. So now we will invite questions both online and in person.
Well, I had a question.
Mhm.
Well, just a thought and then the question. You, on the slide where you had reality versus equality, equity, and justice, you made mention of affirmative action. And one of the arguments for it is that you have systemic problems that have resulted from racism and segregation and all of those bad things. But one of the pushback is that you can't use what caused the problem in the first place to rectify the problem, because affirmative action, as you say, creates gender quotas or skin color, quote unquote, quotas. And so the ideal for any process should be that it's blind. The law should be blind, access to voting rights, blind, access to college registration, blind. The process should be blind. And the pushback is that affirmative action is not blind. So how do you maintain the merit? How do you maintain the objectivity that all of these processes should have with affirmative action, or with even a lot of the statistics that you and measures that you pointed out in the presentation?
Well, I think that's a complex question, not the first one. This is the one that's super loaded. Yeah, so things should be blind, but our eyes work. That's the problem. Our eyes work. And what that means is blindness is an ideal for an equitable, a naturally equitable society. Our societies aren't equitable. In the first place, even in terms of statistics, population-wise. So if we say that something is blind in America, the likelihood is you're going to find more white people coming in because they're in the majority, or, well, America is going brown, but generally we see it as a Caucasian country, right? So that is part of the issue. But because the issues of inequality, whether it's gender, race, sexuality, gender identity, ability, disability, because they are so pervasive and deeply rooted and endemic, it's like you cannot separate it from the structure. And so the ideal is that there's a process. Countries should be going, or organizations should be going through processes. So when you have temporary special measures like affirmative action or quotas, it's not forever. It can't be quotas forever.
People make it seem as if that's the case, right?
It should be, let us put something in here to shock the system for a period. And then when the system now gets used to seeing Shaniqua Javanan applying to Harvard and they get in just on natural selection, then you have reached a stage where you don't need this anymore. And one of my issues too with the affirmative action is that we tend to think that because we're bringing in a Black person or a Dalit woman or a trans this or something, it means they're less qualified. That's not the case. The issue is not about lowering standards to bring in lesser people. The issue is to widen the pool to people who would not normally get this chance because you're not looking at them as people in the first place, right? So that too is part of it, that it's not about lessening. So even when we look at Jamaica, we had this, groups that were training women to go on boards, the 51% coalition. I don't know if any of you know it, but it was a specific group of women who were training women to get women on public boards, because up to about 10 years ago, the public board situation was just ridiculous. Men. Those groups that are training women, you think anybody is training the men who go on boards? Are we training politicians? No, not necessarily. Yeah, you're supposed to have some level of qualification, your lawyer, your economist, and so on. But we're not training people to be senators. We're not training people to be politicians. These groups were training women to operate and be strategic on boards. Yet you're going to say that they're less qualified because they're women. So it's not usually about the qualification. It's not usually about dropping standards. It's usually about our inability to think that a certain person will be able to operate in a certain way because of our deep-seated biases. So that's the point of it. I'm not saying it works all the time, but that's supposed to be the point of it rather than lowering of standards. You had a question? No?
Hi, good
Afternoon.
yeah, good afternoon. I just had a thought. It was very interesting about the scenario when you said that climate change is gendered, and it had to do with issues of the whole idea of living a greener is softer and more feminine, and things like burning fossil fuels and these things. The whole industry is more masculine. But I considered that not only is industry masculine in a sense, but what about the new wave of technology and engineering that, in my mind, is also seemingly very male dominated? But then isn't it the same technology we use to help us fight the climate crisis? So like technology to create things that are biodegradable, for instance. Or I remember my uncles having a discussion about how do we hook up our solar panel to the grid so that these things are also male. So is there any research on the flip side of the coin, whereas instead of saying that it's purely a soft life kind of feminine thing to go green, what about the masculine side of going green as well?
Right, yeah. So there are some reports that are looking at that. I don't know if I love to say I'm ignorant because I don't know. If I don't know, I'm going to say I don't know. I don't know. I don't know about that specifically, but that's a very important reframing. If you ever go into Bath and Body Works, for those of us who like to go in there, 5 years ago, everything was pink and and now there's a whole black section. There's a whole section of Bath and Body Works that's mahogany and blue and black, because they have reframed what it means for a man to use these products, right? And very similar to what you're talking about. A lot of this now, the solar, I know there are a lot of men going into business for portable solar things and the data bank. So there is a shift. There's an evolution. But some of the things, what I think these reports are speaking to are some of the things that you have to do in poor communities without the fanciness of the technology. They're seen as female because it's the things that the woman would have been doing before. And in a community, traditionally, the things that women do, or in a society, the things that women do, men must stay far from that. That's how you define yourself as a man. The least feminine you are, the more masculine you are. So because of the way masculinity is framed in most societies, anything close to that woman work or look is really frowned upon. But that's a very, very good point, that the technology, and it also speaks to the fact that things are not mutually exclusive. You can have things that are bad for the environment that are helping us as well. So that's also a very, very critical point. Any questions on the chat? Nope. Okay. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, then we'll call it a day. Oh, okay.
Which is probably strictly gender related and not necessarily climate change. But do you think the perception that gender that was female centered has led to a marginalization of boys and men in our society today?
Whenever I hear the word marginalization, I get very triggered. Very triggered by the word. So I'm processing the triggering. I want to say yes and no. No, I don't think the issue of gender is what has marginalized men. And I don't like to say that men are marginalized. I think we have a lot of issues with masculinity. But marginalization, the word or the term assumes that men are supposed to be in a certain position. And that's why I don't particularly, and that's why, you know, some of us in the gender space don't particularly like it. But this is not to say that we don't recognize that there are lots of issues to do with masculinity. Underperformance then, right? But I don't know if I can say that it is the perception of gender that has caused that. I think what has happened is that because women were traditionally so discriminated against, and there have been so many decades of work against that discrimination, the work has not been equitable. And it's very recently now that we're actually able to breathe and pause and lift off the gas a little and say, hey, what's going on around us? And the men haven't caught up. In a lot of ways, the masculinity and what we do about masculinity hasn't caught up. The challenge I have with that is that I'm not sure that it's the woman who should do that work. That's the challenge. And so even when you know, for my male colleagues and friends and loved ones, I'm like, do the work, do it, please. You are the ones who men listen to. The men will listen to you. So mentorship and all of these things, it's the men who have to do that work. We do know there's a problem, but I'm not sure that it's the women's movement that must do that type of intervention, because women can only get so far with men. It really needs to come from men. But so that's the kind of complex answer that yes, there's a problem. I don't like to call it marginalization, and I don't think it's our fault. That's the point. I don't think it's our fault.
It's about it's about what I said earlier about
you know, he's not gonna use the mic, right? You've given it to him 3 times and he doesn't use it, so you could stop. He is
what is it though? What I'd said earlier about the whole like more rights for thee, less rights for me. And you said you didn't agree, but I do think that the question that was just asked about the marginalization of men, which I don't necessarily believe in,
right, I understand.
But I do think that is an example of it, in the sense that it might not feel now, if you look through like a modern lens and what we view as rights. But if you put yourself in the position of someone who once had what what were considered certain rights, privileges, accesses, and I mean everything. There's not really many things that are unlimited resources. Everything will. If more people have access to stuff, then people who used to have access to it are just going to lose access if they don't meet what is that set standard. And I think that while I agree, I don't think that like women should bear the brunt of like making sure men progress with the times. I do think that it has been a bit I do think it has been a bit detrimental that we've been pushing it in the sense of I think too often we push equality or equity in a just because someone else has more rights doesn't mean you have to get less. I think that we need to have more of a push of it's fine to lose some rights in order for someone else to gain more rights. Because if you look at, I mean, I'm going to go way back, but if you look at slavery, I mean, that was once a right. You had the right to own slaves. And so with abolition and all those movements, you no longer had a right to own slaves. Now it's inconceivable that could have been a right, but plain and simple on the books, it was like you had the right to own slaves. So when you can no longer own slaves, you
have
lose
lost
those
that
rights.
right, yes.
But that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it just
And
means you have to evolve.
exactly.
You have to evolve.
And I think that's the problem with how I grew up in the whole girl boss era of feminism, where it was, men and women are equal, etc., and all of that. But I remember even growing up, just hearing like through high school, prep school, all those stuff, it was, well, like you're not losing anything, but that just isn't true.
Let me agree with you slightly. On a macro level, you might not think that you're losing anything, but one of the things when we have even debates over abortion rights, for instance, and most persons in a feminist or gender world would be what we call pro-choice. But something I often think about, and of course I'm sure as lawyers you have to grapple with these issues as well, is that if we democratize the access to abortion rights, you infringe on the rights of some of the medical community. So what does that look like if we say every woman at a certain age and under these parameters has a right? It takes away a doctor's rights to say no. And they know the consequences of that infringe on that. So I do agree with you that there has to be any movement and shift in society has to come with evolution. It's not going to be the exact same. If men were the only ones getting into law school and now women are also getting into law school, it certainly is going to limit just the physical spaces for that men tended to have, right? So, or anything that we know that was traditionally male dominated. But I guess fundamentally what it means for me is just using the slavery example that you had is that you pivot, you evolve, you take the necessary steps to say, all right, this thing isn't happening anymore. What do we need to do to keep on par to be successful? And a lot of that work has just not been done. That's really the challenge. So I do agree with you to an extent, yes.
But Dr. Bean, the point he made about some persons having to lose some rights for others to gain, and the time in history where it was a right for some to have slaves. What protects
enslaved people? The history in me is also being triggered. I'm easily triggered today. Yes.
what will protect a society from getting back to that stage, or what should have prevented that stage in history from occurring in the first place? Is it not that the process should have been, or the law should have been blind? And I will continue to repeat
The
that
law of
because
what?
of skin color, of class, of creed, of sect.
Right, so we agree that it should be, but it wasn't.
No, but I'm saying if we don't continue to push that, we will always be at a risk as the ideal. We will always be at a risk of that repeating itself in one form or another.
Yeah, I guess the easy answer is yes.
But then you say
so
our eyes are not blind. That's
no,
what
but our eyes work.
Our eyes work. But if we continue to put policies and procedures in place, both at the macro level and the micro level, as small as it might be, just a university or at a state or a national level, it will work. It will continue to protect against us getting back to that stage in one area of society or another.
Okay, I do see what you're saying. I guess it's so hard to see that because we're so far from that. But yes, philosophically, ideally, that is what it should be. Yes. All right, that's it. Okay.
We're going to invite student Rocky David for a quick presentation.
Good afternoon again, Dr. Bean, on behalf of Miss Levy and all of us here, students, and the entire Norman Manley Legal Aid Clinic and the Norman Manley Law School. We want to thank you for your time, and most importantly, we want to thank you for your expertise. I think it was a very enlightening presentation. I certainly learned a lot, particularly about climate change being gendered. You know, I'm going to do some research on that, some follow-up research. We just want to thank you, and this is a small token of our appreciation.
Appreciate it.
There are lots of cameras looking at you right now.
So I'll go.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Bean. Very enlightening presentation.
Thank you very much.
Hello. Today is our last session.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you again. Okay. So as we wrap up our session, I want you to think about what I opened with. What is it that you want your future to look like? How does climate change affect that? Right, as you go out, most of you will be leaving us shortly. That is students of the Norman Manley Law School. As you go into your different territories and your place of work, as you spread your wings across the world, I want you to think about not only how can you protect your future, but the future of your future generation. And the best way to do that is protecting the environment, looking at how you can also make change as it relates to legislations dealing with climate change. Thanks to all the staff members, to all our IT persons, persons online, presenters, and I hope I have not missed anyone else, but sponsors for especially yesterday, we had a wonderful day at the Mona Baptist Church. And just generally, we invite you hopefully next year, where we'll be hosting another legal aid fair. And thank you. And this was a wonderful event.